Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Jojy.
Welcome back to another episode of The Deconstructed Woman. Elisa Marie and I are here today to talk about an idea that I hadn't really heard about before, but it is something that seems to be taking and has been established in South Korea for some time now. And basically, it is the idea of women cohabitating together as a means to share expenses, sort of ward off loneliness, but they are in a platonic relationship. And they may find love with a partner in the future, but this is a way for them to share a residence today without being independent on their own and covering the costs of all of that together. Independently. And this is based on the book called Two Women Living Together. It was a bestseller when it was published in South Korea in 2019. And the two authors are Hana and Wong, Sunu. And it's been very popular as an idea and a concept. And the author of the article in the newspaper that I saw reviewing it, Maya Singer, was talking about the fact that she lives in New York and the cost of living in New York is very expensive. And so her and her friends have talked about, wouldn't it be wonderful if they could live together, people they get along with, people they choose to spend time with, but that there's no guarantee that they would always be living together, to the test of time, that if something was to change in their life situations, that they would part ways and they would sell the home or, however they would do that. So, Alyssa, what do you think about this concept?
I think it brings me back to when I was in graduate school. I lived, it's kind of like that roommate situation. So I lived with two female roommates, and I think there's so many benefits to this. So when you first kind of presented the topic to me, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think from a cost effective, especially with inflation, makes sense to share quarters and, living space for the cost piece of it, but also like the loneliness piece. To have somebody to kind of come home to talk to decompress from your day. I think there's so many benefits to it. I think that there's pros and cons to everything, but I think some of the things that come to mind are if you have romantic partners, do you have enough space to have privacy? That comes to mind, which I know that, my two roommates and we all had our own bedrooms. But I think that it's different over time and it looks differently. But those were my initial thoughts of this would be great, especially if I were single and trying to, cut down costs, like getting a 2-bedroom townhouse or something like that and having somebody help pay half the bill. I think that's a great way to address that. And I think that it also has a lot of benefits for, that emotional piece to have that support throughout.
Yeah, I agree. I thought about it first when my mom my mom is passed, but she had two nursing buddies. They all got to meet each other in nursing school around that time in their, early 20s. And they all became widows around the same time. And I always said to my mom, I said, you guys could be like the Indian Golden Girls. Your spouses have passed on, your kids have grown, and you guys have known each other, for the majority of your years on this earth. And who better to settle down with and have that last phase of your life? It was interesting because what ended up happening is that some of them got involved with helping raise or watch their grandchildren while their kids were working. And so that plan that I had for my mom and her friends sort of fell apart because of their helping, their own children. But I really thought it would be a great way for them to stay social and stay connected to the people that they really choose to want to spend time with. Plus, I think after you've raised a family, I think it's very hard to learn how to cook for one person. And so I thought that there would also be value in being able to cook for, more than one person because most recipes, I mean, today you can downsize a recipe to one person, but I'm talking about, probably 10 years ago where that wasn't really as common to be able to do on your apps and things like that. And it just seemed like a great opportunity for my mom and her friends. It didn't end up coming to fruition. And I think that they might have all enjoyed it if it had happened. But, in this particular situation, it didn't. But it's something that I'm open to as well as I get older because of the fact that you don't need a whole house to yourself. You don't need that space that, the more space you have, the more you have to clean. And, but it's interesting because what this article talks about is that when you are cohabitating with someone, you know, the issues that we all know who've had roommates in the past, they all start to come up. One person might be cleaner than the other. One person might like to cook a lot more. One person may not be keeping up with their end of the bargain for household responsibilities. One person might be working a lot of hours and really, neglecting the household responsibilities. And so some of those issues that we have to sort out during our, initial marital years, you also have to sort out in this kind of a situation. And I think that people are better at it today because so many of us have lived with roommates in college, or, once you get out of the dorms, you have an apartment and you need roommates. But it is something that you can't ignore. Those kinds of things are pretty, they're still relevant in this kind of a living situation.
Yeah, and I think I mean I'm as you were describing like the DV divvying up the responsibilities. I mean, I can think of a handful of like my closest friends that I know we're similar in personality, and I think that we all kind of have this like overachieving, like I need to take care of other people, like all the all the home responsibilities are on us. And I think like if I was in a home with another person like that and we genuinely divided the responsibilities and I said, okay, I'll do these things, you do these things. And there wasn't kind of this, because I think we've talked about that. Like sometimes the home responsibilities are viewed very differently for men and women. And I feel like having two women specifically in a home, like it would almost feel as if like, oh, okay, they have this, they can take care of this, which I don't always get. I mean, my husband helps in a lot of different ways, but sometimes he said the other day, he was like, I don't know how to clean the bathroom. And it was like, oh, like that's probably my fault. And so I was like, I have to teach him how to clean the bathroom because I had said, I'm doing this area. I need somebody to go clean the bathroom. But it was one of those things where I think we went through that and I was able to help him learn. But he doesn't naturally know like the things that I think traditionally, like sometimes women are given the tasks of learning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do feel like it is our job to share those responsibilities. And I don't know if men use that kind of language to put up like the first level of like resistance to trying something new, or if it's just that they simply actually don't know how to do that. Right. And so, like, my husband said that when he was retiring, and I said, well, you'll have to take care of dinner. And he said, well, I don't know how to cook. And it's like, well, that's simple. We'll just figure that out. Like, we'll, teach you to do that. And now I think he really enjoys having that knowledge. But, it is funny how when we are in a marital relationship, I think certain, gender roles get assigned to different activities. Who takes care of the finances, who takes care of the, cleaning, who takes care of the children, who takes care of, getting kids to their activities. And more and more now, I feel like it might be split up, as much as to 50-50 as one can get to, but that, it still is, I think, pretty lopsided because I think we all feed into the idea, well, that your spouse has to go, the man has to earn the money. And in situations like yours, Alyssa, where you might be the primary breadwinner, are there accommodations made for that? I would tend to think no, because we as a society are not as good at evening the playing field when it comes to those kinds of differences. Even if you might do that in your own home, the greater society is less likely to be considerate of that kind of variable in a typical situation in a home. One of the things that I know that comes up in this article, and I can imagine people saying is, well, women who want to live are together, they must hate men, or, they must not have a future with a partner. And I think, there are some aspects of this that were born out of some kind of a feminist movement in South Korea, but that's not the whole story. It really is more of a convenience factor and financially being able to manage living in an expensive area. If a woman is, without a partner and is trying to live in a safe area or somewhere that she feels, she should be able to afford to do to as a single person. And so I do want to say that right off the bat, that this is not, an article that's written out of some, strong feminist attitude about, hating men or not wanting to, be with a man long term. It really, I mean, obviously there's always a segment that could be involved in that, but that's not the biggest theme in this article. It's really about figuring out how do women do this so they can maintain their autonomy without being forced into a relationship like women might have done 100 years ago or 50 years ago even. So it really is more about women being independent and having the life they choose to want versus having anything to do with a partner, because these two women who write the book are very open to ending this platonic relationship if either one of them was to get involved with a sustainable relationship that was going to take one of those women in a different direction. So there's a lot of flexibility. Obviously, there is the administrative responsibilities of splitting up the house and that kind of stuff, but that would come regardless of if you were a co-signer on a condo, and not necessarily, in this situation. But those kinds of splitting up of the assets as you would have would be the same regardless of if you were just leasing a place together or you had bought a house together. So I want to be clear about that just to be fair to the spirit of this conversation.
Yeah, and I think, it makes me think of I was recently watching the show Love is Blind, and a lot of people were talking about, um, they were single, they lived alone, and they said, it's so nice to come home to somebody. So I'm going back to that piece of it because I think that the emotional support also is really important, especially like you were describing as we're getting older and not having that as much. I think that that's an area that we see a lot of widowers who don't have that support, or, they kind of can't find that type of companionship that they're seeking, which may not be a romantic partner. They may be seeking just companionship. And so I think that it opens up the opportunity for that to blossom in a space where, maybe you wouldn't have had that otherwise.
And one of my, as I was thinking about my mom, I will say that one of the people that she ended up becoming really good friends with was a woman that lived next door to her in like a condo community. Her family had brought her up from the South after her husband had passed and she was getting older, much older. So she was probably 5 or 6 years older than my mom. But, and these two women who lived almost right next to each other. Her name was Edith, and she became sort of an adopted part of our family because she and my mom got along extremely well. They were both widows, and Edith was still driving. My mom couldn't drive. And so it was so cute because my mom knew the area because she had lived there for a long time. Edith was a transplant from the southern states, and she didn't really know the area, but she was a good driver and was still able to drive. And so she and my mom would plan days to go out and go grocery shopping together or run errands together because my mom was sort of the co-pilot and Edith was the driver. And so I think that, now they live next door to each other. And, but I think that that is a very traditional model of how widows, move closer to their families, their children, but don't want to live with their children. They don't want to be a burden to their children, nor do they necessarily want to take care of the grandchildren on in a childcare kind of environment, but they want to be close enough to their children so that they can have regular check-ins with them and they can drop in and they can go over for dinner and things like that. But I think in this new sort of, rotation of what life could be, I could see myself, if I find myself in that situation, not necessarily wanting to, I mean, maybe living next door to somebody would be fine. That might take care of the loneliness factor of it. But I do think that there's something with sharing space with someone that does force interaction in a different way than if you were neighbors next to each other. Because I think the idea of living in your own space might create a division there that would prevent you from being as close as you could if you were living in the same house. Now, an interesting arrangement that my daughter and her roommate has, they have like an upper floor and a lower floor. And so some people live in the bedrooms downstairs, and my child actually has like the upstairs area. And so there's the living room and the bedroom and the kitchen. The living room and the kitchen are a common area, but there's two bedrooms downstairs and one bedroom upstairs. And it's almost like a two flat is what it reminds me of, because they clearly share space together, but they're not in each other's way or in each other's space all the time. And so I think that that's even another idea, is having like, like a basement apartment, or like, you're having your mother-in-law quarters, but it's two individuals that are older that are sharing that space, because it's really conducive to sharing a residence, but also having your independent space, whether it's for, your hobbies that you like to do. I have a good friend of mine who's a quilter, not a quilter, excuse me, a weaver. And so she has her loom set up that would take a certain amount of space. If you like woodworking, there's just hobbies that take up some space. And so you would need the opportunity and the real estate to be able to spread out in, say, like a basement or a situation like that. And so I think there's lots of varieties of this kind of a model. And I think that it has lots of applications to it. Um, I do think that there might be, you'd have to have some ground rules from the get-go. Um, Alyssa, what are some of the ground rules that you had with your roommates when you were in grad school that might be applicable? I'm trying to think of them, but I'm thinking you may already have some things compared to me.
I mean, again, I think that we had to establish. So my one roommate I lived with for, I think, 3 years. And the only reason I moved out is because I moved in with my future husband. But I think like very early on, we just had really frank conversations about, what we were comfortable with. We always, I think there was just a lot of open communication. Now that I think about it, it's just, hey, I'm going to have people over. We always talked about it before we did. We never assumed that the other person would be okay with that. We always just kind of checked in with one another. So I think those were kind of the main things. We didn't really do like a cooking schedule or anything like that. If somebody was cooking, I mean, we typically, would make more. We go out, probably more than we cooked. But I think that there was just kind of an understanding. I think we had two bathrooms, so we each had our own bathroom. Um, and so, you clean your space, but there wasn't any ground rules as far as, the main kitchen area and family room. We kind of just kept tidy. Like I don't know, there was a lot of things that were clearly articulated and communicated, and there was a lot of things that were just assumed. Like we assume we're going to keep our space clean. And, if one person starts vacuuming, another one would just get up and start dusting or something like that. So it really, again, I think there was this kind of understanding of like, this is our shared space. Let's all chip in. I don't think there was like, even when I remember when the garbage would overflow, like just somebody would take it out. And if I saw it, I was like, oh, I'll take it out. And it never felt uneven because we all kind of had that understanding of like, this is our shared space and we're going to make it that.
Yeah, I definitely think that, that would be, well, I guess I've got two thoughts. I think that if you are with people that are similar to yourself and then you're having these conversations, I think it's a good idea. I think that there were a couple times when my child, when she was in college, they actually had to have a conversation because I think they were a little bit sloppier than their roommates. And so there was a division of tasks that actually had to be mapped out and discussed and some expectations set. So I think that that is also, sometimes what has to happen is there just needs to be some agreement on, who's going to do what. And if you're going to rotate tasks, I mean, I would hate to have to clean, the common bathroom all the time. But now, in this living situation, my child has her own bathroom and her roommates have their own bathrooms. And so everybody sort of keeps up with their own. But I've seen it in both scenarios where there was, either a list of duties that were split or there would be, some consensus before you get into signing the agreement or whatever, that you have certain expectations of each other. And as long as you get there, I think that's fine. I know for my child, that was the greatest motivator to keep up their end of the bargain was when their roommates were like, okay, we need to have a chat about this. I mean, that was more of a productive conversation than, all the times maybe they didn't talk about it or they were frustrated with each other or they didn't speak and maybe there was some misunderstandings. I mean, just having a very honest, direct conversation remedied the situation really quickly. And it was really the most effective way to have it. And so whether you know each other or you don't know each other, getting to the point where you can have those conversations or communication again is a really, really significant, as we discussed.
I was going to jump in because I was thinking, as we're talking about this, you had mentioned the Golden Girls. I was thinking of like that era, like Three's Company. Like there's a lot of shows way back when, and I think there's probably like, you know, now we have more of like the reality TV shows, like I mentioned, Love is Blind, where, women are in one section, men are in another. But I think that there's like, this is not a new concept by any means. But it is interesting that like we're now talking about it and kind of reflecting back on it because I think that it's something that, you know, it's obviously been a possibility or an opportunity for many, many years, but we don't see it as much. And I wonder if you have any thoughts of like why that is. Like, why hasn't the Golden Girls just like kind of continued? I mean, that was like people are, you know, we're still talking about the Golden Girls and how like monumental that was, and the concept of having multiple generations in one home, all all female. But I think that it's interesting that we don't see that, or if it wasn't something that I'm like, oh yeah, of course this is what would happen. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that I think as a society, we're typically still pretty traditional. You get married in your 20s or late 20s and you start having children in your 30s and whatnot. But the Golden Girls were very specific because these were women that were single for one reason or another and decided to join forces and financially, split the expenses. And I think that as at that age in your life, I think people see that as being very permissible. I think Three's Company, was really a different situation where having two women live with a man was really unusual, unless, and of course we know the story of Three's Company where Jack had to pretend to be gay as a way to live with two women in that time frame. Today, I don't think it would be really anybody would even blink an eye, really, but that was a side of the times back then. But I think today, I think that this is a really timely conversation, regardless of what age you are, because I think that there are more and more women who are pursuing, education later in their life and waiting longer to get married or waiting for a partner that they want to be completely sure about, not only because of the pressure to have a partner in their life. There are so many women now who are choosing to have children on their own without necessarily having a partner. And so I think the choices for women are so much greater that it would lend itself so much, more readily today. The other thing that also makes me think about it is that, you had brought up inflation and just the cost of living. I remember when the financial crisis that occurred, maybe now like 10, 12 years ago, when 2007, something like that. A lot of the parents that were older than like me at that time were just so frustrated because their college students couldn't move out of the house. They couldn't afford to live on their own. But I don't know why it didn't occur to them to move in with, friends of their own age. And, because if you live with somebody, you don't have to have a mortgage, and you don't have to, or you can have a mortgage, but that mortgage is a lot more doable than having to have a house on your own. So I don't know why that idea hasn't caught fire any, faster. And so you bring up a really interesting point, Alyssa. I'm not sure why it hasn't. I know that that'll be sort of my angle. And I feel like I'm always recruiting for my own golden girl like house, because I'm all, and I meet women who are like-minded or are social as I am, or like having parties and like to do that kind of stuff. I sort of either make a mental note or I will say verbally, like, oh, we'd have a great time together. We could, in our older years. Because I think that the women that I know that are older, their biggest problem is that they are limited by the fact that they own their own house, and that's what they thought was what their life was going to be like, whether it was the home that they and their partner shared together, and now they live there alone, or they'd moved to a single resident close to where their children live, but they weren't going to cohabitate. They were going to live alone. And I almost feel like, I mean, is that the new American dream? Is that what you do when you become a widow? I don't know. I mean, it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I think that this I'm putting it like I would, love to be in like Golden Girls scenario. Not, obviously I have my family, but again, I think I'm like probably fantasizing about like the idea of just kind of, you know, uh the environment and the atmosphere being different in some ways. I mean, I'm surrounded by small children, so that sounds amazing, but I think that it's just an interesting concept, and one that I appreciate having an opportunity to just sit and think about. And I think that it's kind of on par with, what we do here is talk about things that we want to kind of put out there. And I'm curious to hear if other people, hear this and are like, oh yeah, let's do this. Let's, come together in a lot of ways. But I think that it is about it brings me back to the concept of pruning friends, which is like a topic we talked about so like two years ago, I think. Like it was a pretty early topic that we discussed. But I think that so part of that discussion was as we get older, we kind of prune our friends. We, tend to surround ourselves with people that are like-minded. And so I think we naturally kind of set ourselves up to be in that type of situation later on in life too. And I think that's what you were just speaking to as well. And so I think it's interesting that we naturally sometimes do these things, yet, it's not something that readily, like, there's not like facilities where, women go at a certain age. I mean, there's, retirement communities, and I don't have a lot of knowledge of like the setup of those, but I wonder if like that's like the, where our society kind of sees older generations, like if is that where everybody goes? Like I don't know. I have more questions than answers, but I think that it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and I will say, before we close out, I mean, since I've seen my mom become a widow and move into independent living and then assisted care living and then memory care, I do think that, we all, as women, we tend to live longer than men. And as a result of that, there are a lot of women who end up being widows in these retirement homes. But once again, those four walls are really difficult to navigate. And I think even my friend Sandy, who lives in a, I don't know, 65 and older or whatever kind of neighborhood, they're still separated by the fact that the ones who have partners, husbands or such, mostly husbands at that age range, they still have each other. But what do you do when you are a widow that is in a space by themselves? That loneliness, the social isolation, the lack of mental stimulation, all of those things still are present. And if you're living in a facility that has a lot of activities and different things for you to do, that's one way to get some of those needs met. But that's an expensive way to go. And so I think that this conversation, hopefully it helps our listeners think outside the box for what is possible. Because I will tell you, the number one pandemic right now or epidemic is geriatric loneliness. And really, how dementia and other chronic illnesses really are exacerbated by that loneliness. And so we need to do better by our older population and by our grandparents and our aunts and uncles, and really, find different ways to be creative to help maybe come up with ideas that are not blood relations, but really, sort of that, the family we choose to be with, to keep our minds sharp and to stay young in our attitudes and our physical health. Because otherwise, I can tell from my own family experience, that mental acuity does drop when you live by yourself. Because as much as we as families say we're going to stay in touch with our families, we are competing with our own children and what their activities are and how busy we are. It's very, very difficult to keep it all because of just the time that's already being pulling at you as a busy mom and an employee and things like that. And then to add your parents into that mix, it becomes really difficult to live up to all the obligations that we have. So I'm so glad this turned out to be a great topic and I think really thought-provoking. So I appreciate you being open to this conversation.
Well, I appreciate you bringing this topic up because, again, I think that it's an interesting one. So, again, as always, we would love to hear from our listeners. Let us know if this resonated with you, if this is something that you are thinking about, or maybe you're in that phase of life where you're thinking, where do I go now? I think that it's definitely something that, I have some time, but it would consider down the road. And so, again, we thank you for listening, and we hope that this has been a conversation that sparks other conversations, and we look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.